The crowd held its breath, fear mingling with growing defiance. Betsy Miller stepped forward, her cane tapping the ground, her voice shaky but clear. "Henry, you burned my barn. You stole my husband's dream. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Her words, small but violent, awakened something in the others. Tom Jenkins stood, his voice hoarse from years of suppressed rage. Why John Harper thought he'd left Thunder in safe hands, far from harm's reach, but the dark, jagged bruises staining his horse's flanks told a story of betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. The proud stallion, who'd galloped through storms and carried John across the endless prairies of the American West, now stood in the dim light of the barn, head bowed, his spirit bruised as much as his body. John's weathered hands trembled with a mix of rage and sorrow as he ran them along Thunder's coat, feeling the stallion flinch at each tender spot. The marks weren't from a stray kick or a rough trail. They were deliberate, cruel, the kind left by someone who savored inflicting pain. Standing in his modest barn, 10 miles outside the dusty streets of Willow Creek, John's chest tightened with a fury he hadn't felt since his wife Sarah passed 5 years ago. Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was a companion, a silent partner through lonely nights and grueling days, and seeing him hurt like this felt like a violation of everything John held sacred. The morning sun filtered through the barn's slatted walls, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor, and John's mind churned with questions. Thunder was no ordinary animal. He was a legend in these parts, a sleek, powerful stallion admired by every rancher from Willow Creek to the county line. His strength and grace had turned heads at every cattle drive, and John had trusted the town's livery stable to keep him safe during the annual auction, thinking it a better choice than leaving him tied outside the saloon. He'd been wrong, and the weight of that mistake pressed on him like a boulder. "You poisoned my cattle, ruined my right to water. I will not be silent anymore." John's fingers lingered on a particularly dark bruise, and Thunder let out a soft, pained whicker, his dark eyes meeting John's with a trust that made the old rancher's throat tighten. They'd been through so much together, blizzards that turned the plains into a frozen hell, river crossings where the current threatened to sweep them away, and quiet nights under a sky so vast it made a man feel small. Thunder had been there when Sarah's illness took her, when John had no one else to lean on. The horse's nuzzle against his shoulder, a gesture unchanged since he was a colt, was a reminder of that bond, and now someone had tried to break it. John's jaw clenched, his anger simmering into a cold, focused resolve. Whoever did this would answer for it. He stepped back, studying Thunder's lowered head, the way the stallion's proud spirit seemed dimmed, and felt a surge of guilt. He should have known better than to trust the livery, should have sensed something was off when he picked Thunder up yesterday evening. Amos, the livery keeper, had been a nervous wreck, sweating despite the crisp autumn air, his hands fidgeting as he rushed John through the handover. At the time, John had chalked it up to a busy day, but now, seeing the evidence on Thunder's flanks, it was clear Amos knew something. Whether he was involved or just too scared to speak, John would find out. The barn smelled of hay and leather, a familiar comfort that did little to ease the storm in John's heart. He'd spent his 60 years avoiding trouble, preferring the solitude of his 200-acre ranch to the petty dramas of Willow Creek. But this was different. This was personal. John had built his life on fairness, treating his animals with the respect they deserved and expecting others to do the same. Whoever had crossed that line had awakened something in him, a quiet, unyielding determination that had seen him through hard winters and harder losses. He moved to the barn door, gazing toward Willow Creek, where thin trails of smoke rose from morning fires, curling into the pale sky. Somewhere in that town, among its clapboard buildings and bustling streets, was the person responsible. John's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles white with the effort to keep his anger in check. He owed Thunder justice, not just for the pain inflicted, but for the betrayal of trust that had shaken them both. Saddling his second horse, a sturdy mare named Daisy, John's mind raced through possibilities. Who had access to Thunder during those 3 days at the livery? Who was cruel enough to beat a horse for no reason? And who thought they could get away with it, thinking John Harper, the quiet widower who kept to himself, wouldn't fight back? The ride to town would take 45 minutes, enough time to plan, but one thing was already certain. By sundown, John would have answers. Some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences, and harming an innocent animal was one of them. Daisy's hooves kicked up dust as they headed down the dirt trail, the rolling hills of the west stretching out around them. John's thoughts drifted to Sarah, who'd loved Thunder almost as much as he did. She'd have been furious, her green eyes flashing as she demanded justice. The memory of her strength fueled his own, and he vowed not to let her down, not to let Thunder down. Willow Creek's main street hummed with its usual morning rhythm. Women carried baskets of goods to the general store. Men swapped stories about crops and cattle prices, and a few kids chased each other between wagons loaded with hay. To an outsider, it was a picture of small-town peace, the kind of place where folks knew each other's names and shared a nod over coffee. But as John tied Daisy to the hitching post outside the livery stable, he noticed the undercurrent of unease. Conversations hushed when folks spotted him, their eyes darting away. A shopkeeper sweeping his porch suddenly found reason to step inside, and two men across the street crossed to the other side, their steps hurried. John's stomach knotted. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just about Thunder. Amos emerged from the stable before John could call, clutching a dirty rag and wiping his hands as if he could scrub away his guilt. The old man's face was pale, his usual hearty greeting replaced by a strained, "John Harper, didn't expect you back so soon. Thunder all right?" The question hung in the air, heavy with Amos's fear. His eyes flicked toward the stable's dark interior as if he expected someone to step out and silence him. John's heart sank, but his voice stayed steady. "Depends on what you call all right, Amos. Thunder's got marks on him, bruises that don't come from a loose saddle or a rough stall." Amos took a step back, his hands twisting the rag into knots. "Don't know what you're talking about, John. Horse looked fine when you took him yesterday. Maybe he got banged up at your place." The lie was too quick, too practiced, and John saw the fear in Amos's eyes, the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. "Amos," John said, stepping closer, his voice low but firm. "We've known each other 10 years. You've never lied to me before. Why start now?" Amos's face crumpled, his resolve wavering. For a moment, John thought he'd spill everything, but then heavy footsteps echoed from the back of the stable, deliberate and ominous. Amos's expression shut down, his fear swallowing any trace of honesty. "Like I said, I don't know nothing," he muttered, louder this time, as if for someone else's benefit. "Your horse was fine when he left." John turned toward the sound, his heart pounding but his stance unwavering. From the shadows stepped Henry Vaughn, Willow Creek's wealthiest man, his tailored suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the dusty stable. Henry's cold smile sent a chill down John's spine, not from fear but from the realization that this was no accident. Henry owned the bank, the biggest ranch in the county, and had his fingers in every business from the saloon to the feed store. His presence here, now, confirmed John's worst suspicions. "John Harper," Henry said, his voice smooth as snake oil, dripping with false charm. "Heard you're fussing over that horse of yours. Hope you're not stirring up trouble over something that can't be proven." The words carried a veiled threat, and John felt his anger flare, hot and sharp. Henry wasn't just involved, he was the architect of this cruelty. The man's confidence, the way he stood as if he owned the stable and everyone in it, made John's blood boil. "Can't be proven," John repeated, his voice low and dangerous, each word laced with the rage he'd held back since finding Thunder's bruises. "Funny choice of words, Henry. Makes a man wonder what you're so sure needs proven." Henry's smile widened, but his eyes were hard, glittering with amusement. "Horses get hurt, John. They're unpredictable. Sometimes they need a firm hand to keep them in line. Nothing personal." The casual admission hit John like a physical blow, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Henry wasn't even trying to hide it, he was admitting to hurting Thunder, secure in the belief that John couldn't touch him. The arrogance was staggering, but what cut deeper was the implication behind Henry's words. This wasn't just about cruelty, it was about control, about showing John who held the power in Willow Creek. John's mind flashed to Thunder, to the trust in those dark eyes, and he felt a surge of protectiveness that drowned out his fear. "Why Thunder?" John asked, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. Henry shrugged, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve, his nonchalance a deliberate taunt. "Fine animal, that stallion. Strong, fast, worth a pretty penny to the right buyer. I made you an offer last spring, if you recall, $500 more than generous, but you said he wasn't for sale." John remembered that day at the feed store, Henry's too friendly smile and the glint in his eyes that had set John on edge. He'd declined politely, sensing something predatory in the offer. Now, the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "So you beat him," John said, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "Because I wouldn't sell." Henry's smile didn't waver. I showed you what happens when folks don't play ball. Thunder's a valuable horse, but accidents happen. Injuries can ruin an animal's worth. Makes a man think twice about turning down good money. The threat was unmistakable. Sell Thunder or watch him suffer more. John's vision blurred with anger, his heart pounding as he imagined Thunder enduring another beating. Amos stood frozen in the background, his rag a crumpled mess, his face a mask of misery. John saw the fear in the old man's eyes and realized Amos wasn't just scared of losing his job. He was trapped, likely in debt to Henry, forced to stay silent or lose everything. How many others in Willow Creek were in the same bind? John needed answers, but he wouldn't get them here, not with Henry looming like a vulture. "I'll think on it," he said, forcing calm into his voice, though his hands shook with the effort. Henry nodded, as if the matter was settled, his smile smug. "Take your time, John, but accidents can happen any time. Hate to see that fine horse hurt worse than he already is." The words dripped with menace, and John felt a chill despite the warmth of the stable. As Henry sauntered off, his boots clicking on the wooden floor, John turned to Amos, who looked like he might collapse under the weight of his guilt. "How long's this been going on, Amos?" John asked, his voice soft but insistent, trying to reach the man he'd known for years. Amos glanced around, his hands trembling as he whispered, "Too long, John. Henry's got my loan, owns this stable, owns me. Been leaning on folks for years." His voice cracked, and John saw the shame in his eyes, the weight of being complicit in something he despised. "There's something else," Amos added, his voice barely audible, his eyes darting to ensure they were alone. "Mary Sullivan at the tailor shop was asking about Thunder yesterday. Said she saw something Tuesday night when they brought him back. You should talk to her, but John, be careful. Henry don't take kindly to folks poking around." John's heart lifted slightly at the mention of Mary Sullivan. She was a widow, tough as nails, who'd run her tailor shop with a steady hand since her husband's death a decade ago. If anyone had the courage to stand up to Henry, it was her, but if she was asking questions, she was in danger too. John nodded, his resolve hardening. "Thanks, Amos," he said, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath his touch. "Keep your head down. Don't let on we talked." Amos nodded, relief flickering in his eyes, but the fear remained, a reminder of the hold Henry had over Willow Creek. John untied Daisy and headed for the tailor shop, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Thunder anymore. It was about a town living in fear, about people like Amos too scared to speak, about a man who thought he could hurt what John loved and walk away. The street was busy now, folks going about their day, but John felt their eyes on him, their whispers trailing in his wake. He pushed open the door to Mary's shop, the bell jingling softly. Mary looked up from her sewing, her sharp eyes narrowing as she recognized him. A woman in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled into a practical bun, Mary had a reputation for fairness and a backbone of steel. "John Harper," she said, her voice cautious but warm, tinged with worry. "What brings you here?" John glanced around, ensuring the shop was empty. "Amos said you were asking about Thunder. Said you saw something Tuesday night." Mary's hand stilled on the fabric, her jaw tightening with a mix of anger and resolve. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw Henry's men bring Thunder back to the stable. Jake Brody and that new gun hand, Eli Carter. Horse was limping, head hanging low. Looked like they'd worked him over good, John. It was pure meanness, nothing else." Her voice shook with indignation, her eyes flashing with the same fury John felt. "I heard the commotion from my shop, looked out my back window and saw it all. Wasn't hard to figure out what happened." John's heart pounded, his anger mirrored in Mary's words. "Did you see the act itself?" he asked, hoping for a witness. Mary shook her head, her frustration clear. "Not the beating, but I saw enough. Thunder didn't deserve that, and you don't either." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "John, you need to know this ain't just about your horse. Henry's been doing this for months, hurting livestock, burning barns, anything to scare folks into doing what he wants. He owns the bank, the saloon, half the town. Sheriff Tate's in his pocket too. You cross Henry, you lose everything." The scope of it hit John like a stampede. Henry wasn't just a bully, he was a predator, using fear to choke the life out of Willow Creek. John's anger deepened, but so did his determination. "Why's no one spoken up?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Mary's laugh was bitter, her eyes shadowed with years of watching good people suffer. "Who'd listen? Henry's got the law, the money, the power. Folks are too scared to lose what little they got left." Her voice softened, a flicker of hope breaking through. But you're different, John. You don't owe Henry nothing. You could stand up to him. Before John could respond, a frail voice cut through the quiet shop. She's right, you know. John turned to see Betsy Miller, an 80-year-old widow, sitting in a rocking chair in the corner, her knitting needles clicking steadily. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, fixed on John with a mix of sorrow and defiance. Henry's been at it for years. Tried to buy my husband's land back in '75. When we refused, our barn burned down. No proof it was Henry, but we knew. Lost everything but our pride. Betsy's voice trembled with old grief, but her chin lifted, her resolve unbroken. You're fighting for that horse, John, but you're fighting for all of us. John's throat tightened, Betsy's words sinking deep. If a woman her age had faced Henry's wrath, how many others had suffered in silence? He looked at Mary, then Betsy, seeing the same fire in their eyes that burned in his own heart. Thank you, he said, tipping his hat, his voice thick with emotion. I'm gonna fix this, for Thunder, for you, for everyone. Henry's hurt. Mary's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear crossing her face. John, you're one man against Henry Vaughn. Be careful. John nodded, but as he stepped back into the street, the weight of his promise settled on his shoulders. Careful wasn't enough. Henry had gone too far, and John would make him pay. Not just for Thunder, but for the town he'd broken. As he mounted Daisy, the sun climbing higher, John felt the eyes of Willow Creek on him. This was bigger than one horse, bigger than one man's anger. It was about justice, and John Harper was ready to fight for it. John Harper wasn't looking for a war, but Henry Vaughn had made this personal, and the bruises on Thunder's flanks burned in John's mind like a brand. The quiet rancher who'd spent his 60 years avoiding the squabbles of Willow Creek now found himself at the heart of a fight bigger than he'd ever imagined. With the truth about Henry's cruelty laid bare, John set out to uncover the full scope of the man's corruption, driven by a fire in his chest that refused to be quenched. The sun was barely above the horizon as he rode Daisy back to his ranch, the 10-mile trail giving him time to think, to plan, to steel himself for what lay ahead. Thunder's pained whicker echoed in his ears, mingling with Mary Sullivan's warning and Betsy Miller's trembling defiance. Henry wasn't just a bully, he was a predator, sinking his claws into the heart of Willow Creek, and John knew he couldn't fight him alone. He needed evidence, allies, and a spark to ignite the town's buried courage. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and earth, but beneath it, John felt the weight of fear that clung to the town like dust. This wasn't just about saving Thunder anymore, it was about breaking the chains that held Willow Creek captive. Back at the ranch, John dismounted and led Daisy to the barn, pausing to check on Thunder. The stallion stood in his stall, his wounds cleaned but his spirit still shaken. John ran a gentle hand along the horse's neck, murmuring, "We're gonna make this right, boy. I promise." Thunder's dark eyes met his, and for a moment, John felt the old connection between them, a bond forged through years of trust. It steadied him, grounding his anger into purpose. He couldn't let Henry's men touch Thunder again, and he couldn't let the town keep suffering under the man's iron grip. Mary had spoken of Henry's pattern: livestock harmed, barns burned, families driven out. Betsy's story of her lost barn had confirmed it. John needed to know how deep this went, and he needed people willing to stand with him. He saddled Daisy again, his jaw set, and headed back to town, this time taking the back roads to avoid prying eyes. Henry's influence was everywhere, and John couldn't afford to be seen moving against him. Not yet. His first stop was Tom Jenkins' farm, a 50-acre spread just beyond the ridge from John's own land. Tom was a grizzled farmer, his face lined from years under the sun, and John had heard whispers about the bad luck that had struck his cattle last month. 2 cows found limping, their hides marked with cuts no accident could explain. John found Tom splitting wood outside his barn, the rhythmic thwack of his axe pausing as John approached. "Heard about Thunder," Tom said, setting the axe down, his voice low and heavy with worry. "Same thing happened to my stock. Found him cut up, barely able to walk. No proof it was Henry's men, but I ain't dumb, John." His eyes, shadowed with fatigue, held a mix of anger and resignation. "Henry wanted my water rights for his ranch. I said no, and my cows paid for it." John's stomach twisted, his anger flaring anew at the thought of Henry's men taking their cruelty to another man's livestock. "Why didn't you say something, Tom?" he asked, though he knew the answer before Tom spoke. Tom wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling slightly. Henry's got the sheriff, the bank, half the businesses in town. I got a wife, 3 kids, and a mortgage I can barely keep up with. Cross him, and I lose everything. The fear in Tom's voice was raw, a mirror of Amos's desperation, and John felt a pang of sympathy. This was what Henry counted on. Good people too scared to fight back. "You're not alone anymore," John said, his voice firm but kind. "I'm going after Henry, but I need folks to stand with me. You in?" Tom's eyes searched John's face, as if weighing the risk against the flicker of hope John's words offered. After a long moment, he nodded, his jaw tightening. "If you're standing up to him, I'll back you. Just tell me what to do." John clapped a hand on Tom's shoulder, feeling the farmer's resolve strengthen, and promised to meet him later. One ally gained, but John needed more. Next, he rode to the saloon where Clara, a young barmaid with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, worked the evening shift. Mary had mentioned Clara might have seen something the night Thunder was hurt, and John trusted her instincts. The saloon was quiet in the late morning, with only a few old-timers sipping whiskey and swapping stories. Clara was wiping down the bar, her movements brisk, but her eyes wary as John approached. "Heard you were asking about Thunder," she said before he could speak, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze flicking to the saloon's back door. "I saw Henry's men, Jake Brody and that gun hand from St. Louis. Eli Carter, dragging your horse to the stable Tuesday night. Heard Thunder whinnying something awful like they were tearing him apart." Her voice cracked, her hands gripping the rag tightly, and John saw the fear in her eyes, tempered by a spark of defiance. "I wanted to do something, John, but Henry's got eyes everywhere. Last week he had Eli rough up old man Carter, no relation, for refusing to sell his blacksmith shop. I'm tired of being scared, but I'm scared all the same." John leaned closer, his voice gentle but steady. "You don't have to be scared alone, Clara. Meet me at the old warehouse on Miller's Hill tonight. Bring anyone you trust." Clara's eyes widened, a mix of hope and dread crossing her face, but she nodded, her lips pressing into a determined line. "I'll be there," she whispered, and John saw the same fire in her that he'd seen in Mary, a flicker of courage ready to catch flame. As he left the saloon, his boots kicking up dust on the boardwalk, John noticed a crumpled piece of paper half buried in the dirt near the stable. Curiosity piqued, he bent to pick it up, unfolding a yellowed letter dated 20 years ago, addressed to his father from Henry Vaughn's father. The words were a cold offer to buy the Harper Ranch for a fraction of its worth, with a scrawled note in the margin. "Refused. Will regret it." John's heart sank, a chill running through him. Henry's greed wasn't new. It was a family legacy, stretching back decades, and Thunder's beating was just the latest move in a long game of control. The letter felt like a ghost from the past, whispering that this fight was personal in ways John hadn't imagined. By evening, the old warehouse on Miller's Hill stood silent under a sky streaked with pink and gold. Its sagging roof let in slivers of moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the dusty floor. John arrived early, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and anxiety. He wasn't sure who would show, if anyone, but he couldn't do this alone. Mary Sullivan was the first to slip through the creaking door, her ledger tucked under her arm, its pages thick with notes on Henry's crimes. Her face was set with determination, but her eyes held a flicker of fear, as if she knew the risk she was taking. Tom Jenkins followed, his shoulders hunched but his jaw set, his wife's worried words still ringing in his ears. Clara arrived next, bringing old man Carter, the blacksmith, his face bruised from Eli's fists, but his eyes burning with defiance. Betsy Miller shuffled in, her knitting needles clicking nervously, her frail frame belying the steel in her voice. To John's surprise, nearly 20 others trickled in, farmers, shopkeepers, even Miss Eleanor, the town school teacher, whose brother had lost his land to Henry's foreclosure. Each face carried the weight of fear, but also a spark of hope, a longing to be free. John stood before them, his hat in his hands, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "I know why you're here," he began, meeting each pair of eyes. "You're tired of living in fear, tired of Henry Vaughn destroying everything decent about this town. He hurt my horse, your homes, your livelihoods. We can stop him, but only if we stand together." His words carried the weight of his anger, his love for Thunder, his grief for Sarah, and the crowd leaned in, their fear mingling with a growing resolve. Mary opened her ledger, her hand steady despite the tremble in her voice. "I've been writing down everything Henry's done. Foreclosures, livestock injuries, fires that weren't accidents. The Peterson family lost their orchard last year. The Hendersons' farm burned out 2 summers ago. This is enough to bury him, but we need to get it to the territorial governor." Her voice cracked with emotion, a mix of anger and hope, and John saw the crowd stir, their fear giving way to possibility. Tom spoke up, his voice rough with suppressed rage. "Henry'll come after us if we try this. He's got Sheriff Tate and those gun hands, Jake and Eli." Clara nodded, her eyes wide with worry. "He's right. Henry's men are always watching. I saw him rough up Carter just for saying no." Old man Carter rubbed his bruised jaw, his voice low but firm. "I ain't backing down this time. Henry took enough from me." Betsy's needles stopped, her frail voice cutting through the tension. "He took my husband's dream when he burned our barn. I'm too old to be scared anymore." The room buzzed with murmurs, a mix of agreement and doubt, and John felt the weight of their hope resting on him. "We can't fight Henry with his methods," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We don't have his money or his guns, but we have the truth, and we have each other. Deputy Daniel's young, but I think he wants to do right. We get this ledger to him, let him take it to the governor, and Henry's done." Clara frowned, her voice sharp with skepticism. "Daniel's loyal to Tate. He won't help." John met her gaze, his own resolve unwavering. "Sometimes a man just needs a chance to choose the right side. I'm betting on Daniel." Before anyone could respond, a creak echoed from the warehouse door, sharp and ominous in the quiet night. The group froze, hands reaching for makeshift weapons, a pitchfork, a hammer, a knife. Eli Carter, Henry's gun hand from St. Louis, stepped into the moonlight, his hand resting on his revolver, his eyes glinting with menace. "Heard there was a meetin'," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Henry don't take kindly to conspiracies." The air thickened with fear, and John felt his heart pound, but he stepped forward, his voice calm despite the danger. "This ain't a conspiracy, Eli. It's justice. You can join us or stand with a man who'll toss you aside when he's done with you." Eli's hand twitched on his gun, his eyes narrowing as he studied John. The room held its breath, every face taut with terror and defiance. For a moment, John thought Eli would draw, but something in John's steady gaze made the gun hand hesitate. "You're making a mistake, Harper," Eli said finally, his voice low and uncertain. He backed toward the door, disappearing into the night, leaving the group shaken but unbroken. John turned to them, his voice steady. "We don't have much time. Henry'll know we're planning something by morning. Tomorrow we get that ledger to Daniel. We move fast, act normal, and give no sign anything's changed. Who's with me?" One by one, hands went up, Tom's, Clara's, Carter's, Betsy's, and more. Their fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a growing fire, a shared resolve to fight back. John felt it too, a spark of hope igniting in his chest, but he knew the danger was far from over. Henry Vaughn wouldn't wait for a threat to grow. He'd strike first, and John had to be ready. As the group dispersed into the darkness, John mounted Daisy, the letter from Henry's father burning a hole in his pocket. This fight was for Thunder, for Sarah, for every soul Henry had crushed, and John Harper was ready to see it through. The sun rose over Willow Creek, painting the dusty streets with a golden glow that promised a new day. But for John Harper, it signaled the start of a battle that would either free the town or break it. Thunder's bruises, the letter from Henry Vaughn's father, and the trembling courage of the townsfolk burned in John's mind, fueling a resolve that had grown from personal anger to a fight for the soul of a community. He'd started this for his horse, but now it was about every man, woman, and child who'd suffered under Henry's iron grip. As John saddled Daisy before dawn, the 10-mile ride to town loomed like a gauntlet, each hoofbeat carrying the weight of hope and fear. The ledger in his saddlebag, copied meticulously by Mary Sullivan, held the truth about Henry's crimes, enough to bury him if it reached the territorial governor. But Henry was no fool. He'd sensed the shift in the air, the whispers of rebellion, and John knew a man like that didn't wait for threats to grow. Today Willow Creek would face its reckoning, and John was ready to lead the charge, his heart pounding with a mix of determination and dread. Back at the ranch, John paused to check on Thunder, the stallion's wounds healing but his spirit still fragile. John ran a hand along the horse's flank, whispering, "We're gonna end this, boy. For you, for Sarah, for everyone." Thunder's dark eyes met his, a flicker of the old fire returning, and John felt a surge of love for the animal who'd been his rock through years of loneliness. The bond steadied him, grounding his anger into purpose. He couldn't fail, not when Thunder's trust and the town's hope rested on him. Mounting Daisy, John rode to town, the ledger heavy in his saddlebag, its pages a weapon sharper than any gun. Mary had spent the night copying every detail, dates, witnesses, damages, ensuring nothing could be lost. Deputy Daniel was their key. If he'd take the evidence to the governor, Henry's empire would crumble. But Daniel was young, tethered to a corrupt sheriff, and John knew convincing him would be a gamble. At the sheriff's office, John found Daniel polishing his badge, his young face etched with tension. "Mary told me about the meetin'," Daniel said before John could speak, his voice low and strained. "I know what Henry's done. Everybody does. But Sheriff Tate's got me on a short rope. If I cross him, I lose my badge, my home, everything." His eyes darted to the door, fear warring with a flicker of guilt. John leaned closer, his voice firm but kind, carrying the weight of his 60 years. "You became a deputy to protect folks, Daniel, not to prop up a bully. Take this ledger to the governor. You'll be the man who saved Willow Creek." He handed over the leather-bound book, its pages thick with the town's pain. Daniel's hands shook as he took it, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with his fear. After a long moment, he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it. God help me, I'll do it." John clapped a hand on his shoulder, relief washing over him, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead. "Ride fast," he said. "Henry'll come for us when he hears." As Daniel mounted his horse and galloped out of town, dust trailing behind him, John headed to the town square, where Mary, Tom Jenkins, Clara, Betsy Miller, and a dozen others waited. Word of the warehouse meeting had spread, and folks whispered behind their hands, their eyes flicking nervously toward the bank where Henry held court. The air crackled with tension, a mix of fear and fragile hope. Mary stood tall, her gray hair pulled tight, her eyes burning with resolve. "Daniel's on his way," John told her, keeping his voice low. "Now we keep our heads down, act normal, till the governor's men arrive." Mary nodded, but her hands gripped her shawl, betraying her anxiety. "Henry'll know something's up," she said. "He's got spies everywhere." Tom, standing nearby, shifted uneasily, his face lined with worry for his family. "If he comes for us, we ain't got much to fight with," he muttered. Clara, her barmaid's apron still dusted with flour, chimed in, her voice sharp with defiance. "We got the truth, Tom. That's more than Henry's got." Betsy, leaning on her cane, nodded, her frail voice steady. "I've lived too long to let that man scare me anymore." Mid-morning, the square grew quiet as Henry Vaughn strode in, flanked by Jake Brody and Eli Carter, his gun hands casting long shadows. His tailored suit was crisp, but his smile was gone, replaced by a cold fury that chilled the air. The crowd parted, their whispers dying as Henry's eyes locked on John. "Harper!" he called, his voice loud enough to draw every eye. "You think you can turn this town against me? I built Willow Creek. I own it. Every shop, every loan, every soul." His words dripped with arrogance, but John saw the crack in his confidence, the way his hands twitched as if sensing his control slipping. John stepped forward, his boots firm on the dusty ground, his voice steady despite the pulse pounding in his ears. "You don't own people, Henry, and you don't own thunder. You hurt my horse to bully me into selling. Now we got proof of every dirty deal you've done. Foreclosures, fires, beatings. It's over." Henry's face reddened, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You got nothing," he spat. "No sheriff, no governor's gonna touch me." He reached into his coat and tossed a heavy pouch at John's feet, coins clinking inside. $5,000. Take it, sell me thunder, and walk away. Or things get worse. For you, for them, for everyone. The crowd murmured, fear creeping back like a shadow. John's heart raced, his anger flaring at the thought of Thunder suffering again, but he kicked the pouch away, the coins scattering in the dust. "Thunder ain't for sale, and neither am I," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet strength that silenced the square. "You're done, Henry. The governor's got your number." The crowd held its breath, their fear mingling with a growing defiance. Betsy Miller stepped forward, her cane tapping the ground, her voice trembling but clear. "You burned my barn, Henry. Took my husband's dream. I ain't scared of you no more." Her words, frail yet fierce, sparked something in the others. Tom Jenkins straightened, his voice rough with years of suppressed rage. "You poisoned my cattle, ruined my water rights. I'm done staying quiet." Clara followed, her hands clenched, her eyes blazing. "I saw your men beat Old Man Carter for standing his ground. We're not your pawns." Old Man Carter, his bruised face grim, nodded. "You took my shop, my pride. No more." Even Miss Eleanor, the schoolteacher, spoke up, her voice soft but firm. My brother lost his land to your schemes. We're through bowing to you. Henry's face twisted with rage, his control unraveling as the town found its voice. You think you can defy me? He roared, nodding to Jake and Eli, their hands hovering over their revolvers. The crowd tensed, fear flickering, but John stood firm, his eyes locked on Henry's. This ain't your town anymore, he said. It's ours. Before Henry could respond, hoofbeats thundered down the street, a cloud of dust rising in their wake. Deputy Daniel rode in, flanked by 3 territorial marshals, their badges gleaming in the sunlight. The lead marshal, a grizzled man with a voice like gravel, stepped forward, holding up the ledger. Henry Vaughn, you're under arrest for extortion, fraud, and assault. This book's got enough to put you away for years. Henry's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through his arrogance. He lunged for his gun, but Eli Carter, to everyone's shock, grabbed his arm. It's over, boss, Eli said, his voice low and resigned. I ain't going down with you. Jake hesitated, then dropped his weapon, his hands rising in surrender. The marshals moved in, cuffing Henry as he shouted curses, his empire crumbling in the dust. The crowd erupted in cheers, their fear giving way to joy, a wave of relief washing over Willow Creek. John watched, his heart swelling with pride and exhaustion. They'd done it. Not just for Thunder, but for every soul Henry had crushed. Weeks later, Willow Creek felt reborn. Henry sat in a territorial prison cell, awaiting trial, his influence shattered. Sheriff Tate had fled, leaving Daniel as interim sheriff, his badge now a symbol of hope. John rode Thunder through his pasture, the stallion's stride strong again, his scars fading like the town's wounds. Mary, Tom, Clara, and Betsy joined John at the ranch for a Sunday supper, their laughter filling the air for the first time in years. Betsy raised a glass of cider, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. To Thunder, she said, and to John, who showed us we ain't powerless. John smiled, his gaze drifting to Thunder grazing under the wide sky, the horse's spirit unbroken. To standin' together, he said, his voice thick with emotion, to never lettin' fear win. The town had learned what John had always known. Survival wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about refusing to let it define you. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the rolling hills, Willow Creek stood taller, its people walking with heads high, knowing they'd proven something vital. Ordinary folks, when united, could topple any tyrant. John patted Thunder's neck, thinking of Sarah, of the town, of the fight they'd won. The scars remained, but they were badges of courage, proof that love and justice could outlast even the darkest shadows. And as the stars began to speckle the sky, John felt a peace he hadn't known in years, certain that Willow Creek would never bow again. The story of John Harper and his fight for justice in the bruised spirit resonates deeply, tapping into the American values of courage, community, and standing up for what's right. John's journey, sparked by the cruel bruises on his beloved horse Thunder, mirrors the struggles many face when confronted with injustice. His anger and love for Thunder drive him to challenge Henry Vaughn's tyranny, but it's his refusal to back down that transforms him from a solitary rancher into a beacon of hope. The emotions, John's rage, the townsfolk's fear, and their collective triumph feel raw and real, reminding us that even in the face of overwhelming power, one person's resolve can ignite change. Mary's quiet strength, Betsy's defiant spirit, and Daniel's redemption show how ordinary people, when united, can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. This story hits home for anyone who's felt powerless but dreamed of fighting back. The lessons here are timeless. First, courage starts small but grows with action. John didn't set out to save Willow Creek, just to protect Thunder, but his willingness to act inspired others. In life, standing up for what matters, whether it's a personal principle or a community cause, can spark a ripple effect. Second, community is our greatest strength. Alone, the townsfolk were too scared to challenge Henry, but together they were unstoppable. This reminds us to lean on others, to build bonds that turn fear into power. Finally, justice requires persistence. John's victory wasn't instant. It took strategy, patience, and faith in the truth. We can apply this by staying committed to our values, even when the odds seem stacked against us. In our lives, these lessons translate to standing firm, whether it's calling out unfairness at work, supporting a neighbor, or fighting for a cause. Like John, we can start with what's personal, let it fuel our resolve, and rally others to create change. The story teaches us that no one is truly powerless when they choose to act with heart and unity. If this story moved you, hit that like button to show your support. Share it with friends who need a dose of inspiration, and subscribe for more tales of courage and justice. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you'd fight for in your own Willow Creek. Your engagement keeps these stories alive, so let's keep the conversation going.